for joining us and for allowing us to hear from you about José Emilio. Allow me to first introduce Ambassador Marta Bárcena, who is the Ambassador of Mexico in the United States. Her Excellency Ambassador Bárcena was appointed by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and ratified by the Mexican Senate on December of 2018, becoming the first female ambassador to hold this position. Ambassador Bárcena joined the Mexican Foreign Service in 1979, and prior to arriving in Washington, D.C., she was posted as permanent representative to the United Nations Rome-based agencies. On the multilateral level, Ambassador Bárcena has represented Mexico as delegate at the UN, UNESCO, and the OAS, as well as head of delegation at the Forum on Migration and Development. She has also participated in multiple international conferences organized by the G20 and the World Humanitarian Summit. Let's begin the conversation. Thank you very much, Ambassador Bárcena. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Ishnik. Thank you, Ignacio. Thank you, Sandra. Professor, Messenger, Dr. Sánchez-Prado, but now sharing this afternoon with you with the wonderful work of José Emilio Pacheco, I feel that you are friends so that I can call you yes. Sandra and Ignacio.
Por favor. Sí.
So thank you, Ishnik. Before introducing and presenting our participants of today's session, I would like to start reciting a brief quote from José Emilio Pacheco about poetry. And he wrote, I like poetry to be the interior voice, the voice no one hears, the voice of the person reading it. That is how the I becomes you, the you becomes I, and in the act of reading is born the we that only exists in that intimate, full moment of reading. And I think we are in this full moment of reading, remembering José Emilio, and sharing that we in the present and in the future. And I want also to tell you a wonderful message that we received today from Cristina Pacheco, that she's really sent us a message saying that she was very moved that we were organizing this session and to be able to listen again the voice of José Emilio Pacheco, and that he's thrilled that some other people will again listen his voice and share this moment with us. José Emilio Pacheco is often described as the most important Mexican poet of the second half of the 20th century. The importance of his work in Mexican literature is monumental. During his prolific career, he earned numerous recognitions, including the Cervantes Award in 2009, the highest honor for literature in a Spanish language. He moved fluently between different genres, poetry, essay, short story, narrative. Probably his strongest imprint in the Mexican collective imagery was with Las Batallas en el Desierto, which take place during post-World War II in Mexico City, where the modernization of the country was paralleled by the influence and adoption of the American way of life. But also his weekly essays, published first in Excelsior and then in the magazine Proceso, who were published under the title Inventario or Inventory, and that changed the life of many people and many students that read him every week to see, to interpret reality and to take cues on what to read for the future. During his tenure of almost 20 years as a professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese program of the University of Maryland from 1986 to 2006, he was granted the university's most prestigious title, University of Maryland Distinguished University Professor. To date, the Mexican Cultural Institute and the University of Maryland honor his memory through the José Emilio Pacheco Distinguished Lecture every year and seminar series that serves as a forum for intellectuals whose work focuses on the literature and culture of Mexico and Latin America. And we work very closely with Sandra.
Yeah.
José Emilio Pacheco passed away in Mexico City in 2014 at the age of 74. He survived by his wife, Cristina Pacheco, a well-known journalist and also a great writer, particularly of short stories, and his two daughters. One of them, Laura Emilia Pacheco, wrote his biography, A mares llueve sobre el mar, told through his cat's eyes, Orso. Orso recalls that what the poet enjoyed the most was writing by hand, in the night, using his fountain pen, in absolute silence, in La Colonia Condesa, in the Condesa neighborhood. And now, please allow me to introduce the distinguished guest that will be joining our conversation this afternoon. Ignacio Sánchez-Prado, his areas of research include Latin American intellectual history, neoliberal culture, world literary theory, and Mexican literary film and cultural studies. So I would say he's really a Renaissance man. Dr. Sánchez-Prado has published over 120 scholarly articles in academic books and journals. His most recent essays include a study on the theories of transcultural and global novel in Latin America, published by New Literary History, and an article on Rick Bayliss and Diana Kennedy, published in Bulletin of Spanish Studies. Beyond the academy, he has been a contributor to media outlets in Mexico and the US, including the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, the BBC, El Universal, Public Books, Work Without Borders, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others. He will be in residence at the Library of Congress. We will have that privilege during the summer of 2021 as the chair of the Cultures of the South at the Cluj Center. We're looking forward to see you here in Washington, DC, and enjoy your erudition, dear Ignacio. Sandra Messinger Cypess is Professor Emerita of Latin American Literature and has served as chair of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Maryland, whose faculty she joined in 1994 after having been at SUNY Binghamton University since 1976. Sandra received her BA at Brooklyn College, majoring in Spanish and French. Her master's degree was awarded from Cornell University and her PhD from the University of Illinois. Her research deals primarily with women writers, which I share your interest in, the representation of women in Latin American literature and Latin American theater. Her theoretic focus centers on feminist theory and semiotics. A very important data for all of you listening to us today is that Sandra knew and met personally José Emilio Pacheco during his years coming to Maryland. So it is a privilege to have her with us today. I want to thank you, Professor Ignacio Sánchez, Dr. Ignacio Sánchez, for your valuable time. We are fortunate enough to have 3 recordings made by José Emilio Pacheco himself for the Library of Congress. Perhaps we can use each recording that we have put in a video to serve as introduction to discuss different aspects of José Emilio's work and legacy. The first one that we will hear is José Emilio Pacheco reciting the poem Alta Traición, High Treason, which is a poem that I think many Mexicans know by heart. So here it goes, the video.
Soy José Emilio Pacheco y estoy grabando para la Biblioteca del Congreso en la Ciudad de México hoy 16 de enero de 1976. Y ahora del libro No me preguntes cómo pasa el tiempo de 1969, una serie de poemas muy breves, como este que se llama Alta Traición. Dice: no amo mi patria, su fulgor abstracto es inasible, pero aunque suene mal, daría la vida por 10 lugares suyos, ciertas gentes, puertos, bosques de pinos, fortalezas, una ciudad deshecha, gris, monstruosa, varias figuras de su historia, montañas y 3 o 4 ríos.
Gran poema. Creo que todos daríamos ahorita la vida en este año, quizás por 3 o 4 ríos de nuestros países. Bueno, La obra de José Emilio Pacheco, the work of José Emilio Pacheco as a poet stands out amongst American audiences. First, Ignacio. I would like to say Pacheco was said to be a poet that was socially concerned to address the burning issues of his time. Can you tell us a bit about the context in which Pacheco's work as a poet became known to Mexico and later to the world? How do you evaluate that, that work of José Emilio?
Thank you, Ambassador, and it's very good to be here with Sandy and other friends. So José Emilio Pacheco's work is very much aligned with the process of urbanization and modernization in Mexico, particularly in the second part of the 20th century. And, you know, those of us who grew up later than this don't have a historical memory, but it is true that what Mexico looked like decade by decade in these different years was changing dramatically through a demographic explosion, the expansion of the city, right? The increasing influence of Americanization, which is one of the topics of his most famous novel, The Battles of the Desert, right? The ties between Mexico and the United States deepened in these times. So I always have read José Emilio Pacheco as both a poet and a narrator of what does it mean to live in this process of rapid modernization and transformation, and the ways in which the present and the past are in conflict whenever you are experiencing this vertiginous explosion in your way of life. There is a poem that I really like by José Emilio called El Mañana, where he says, you know, we were told when we were young, we should fight and sacrifice for tomorrow. But now we're seeing the horror of the today, and this was the tomorrow of yesterday, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So he really registers in his poems, even in Alta Traición, the poem we just heard, he really registers sort of this before and after of history in the moment in which Mexicans were experiencing these radical transformations. And these are, of course, not unique transformations to Mexico. As the poetry resonates in many transnational contexts because ultimately many societies around the world, including the United States, were experiencing this massive economic and populational growth, and life between 1950 and 1960, 1960 and 1970 was so different from each other that the poetry becomes a way to capture the process rather than the snapshots of the past.
Mm-hmm.
It is certainly that his work is very much linked to this urbanization and industrialization of Mexico that changed the face of Mexico City, which is a recurring theme in many of his works. In the poetry, in short stories, I was just rereading La Zarpa about the story of two women and Santa Maria la Ribera. And this, so Sandy, as an expert in Latin America, what do you think his poems say about the Mexico and Latin America of the 20th century? You know, always Pacheco's literary as well refer to us, to Carlos Monsiváis, to Sergio Pitol, to Tomás Segovia. Mm-hmm. How do you see the evolution of the Latin America literature and poetry in his time, and how does Pacheco fits in that evolution?
Well, I just want to add too that Pacheco was the first to write a poem about the metro when it came out. And he always mentions that, La Fiesta Brava, you know, it's about bullfighting, and it's about an American who comes to Mexico and rides the metro. And of course, there's an unfortunate accident. I won't tell more about what goes on, but it's a wonderful story. And I think what he does is make things very personal, just as he did with Alta Traición, you know, with High Treason. He doesn't bring in the grandiose rhetoric that is institutionalized, but he gives us the personal touch always. And I think that that's what makes his work so wonderful. And when he talks about in The Battles in the Desert too, about this young boy, he's talking about, as Nacho was saying, you know, a trajectory for many people in the 20th century, the changes that we undergo, and how time, you know, seems to pass us by. And he has that wonderful title, No me preguntas cómo pasa el tiempo. Don't ask me how time goes by. And in a sense, what he's doing is engaging with the reader. I think for me, he's telling us about what he thinks, what his experiences are, and again, bringing us into that dialogue. And so we think about our times and our past and our needs. And I can't help but say that he's a very lyrical and he's a very intimate kind of poetry and story, where the reader is always engaged. And I think for that reason, he can bring us through the whole trajectory of what's going on in the 20th century, the changes, the new things about having a subway, for example, or then, using telephones and cellulars, things like that. He anticipates in this way he tells the stories about the past and bringing us into the future, and how fast it disappears. Like we will hear one of his poems soon about how time just seems to disappear fast on us, and we look back and wonder. And so he's the kind of writer who addresses us in a very intimate way. And so whatever we read by him seems to be in a dialogue with the writer. And I think that's what I admire so much about him. When you read him, I was reading him again and thinking, oh yes, I hear his voice. I hear him talking and telling us to be thoughtful, be thinking about what's happening to us.
No, I totally agree, and I think that is why it makes José Emilio so contemporary and so, let's say, easy for the reader to identify with him, to feel it so close and personal.
Yes, I want to share something that I just read, very surprisingly. Of course, as you all mentioned, Batallas en el Desierto, Battles in the Desert, is a novel that was in the high schools of Mexico. Everybody read it. And a psychologist wrote an article about using Batallas en el Desierto with a young man who did not want to read. He was very upset about reading, and he started, and she had to figure out a way of getting him involved. And so she asked him to draw, and he began drawing pictures from each of the different chapters. And then he stopped, and she said, why? He said, because I want to continue reading and see what's happened. And it made me think that novel was like a Harry Potter before, avant la lettre, right? It made many people want to read. And here is a documented example of that experience, one educator and one student, but I'm sure it happened in many cases. And I thought that was fabulous.
Yes, I'm totally certain that it happens. He really caught the attention of the reader, and he really makes you go into the story. And then, Ignacio, this reflection that we can do together, or that we want to learn from you, how do you fit José Emilio Pacheco in all this movement of poetry, of Tomás Segovia, of writers as Sergio Pitol, of writers as Carlos Monsiváis? I may be saying something totally that could get me into the Inquisition and burned in green fire, but I must say I always enjoyed more José Emilio Pacheco than Monsiváis. The styles are different, but my style personally was closer to José Emilio than to Carlos Monsiváis, although I loved Por mi Madre Bohemios, but it was another kind of reflection with José Emilio. But this is a personal point of view and experience. What is your analysis of how do you make José Emilio interact or fit with all these great figures of Mexican cultural life and literature?
So Monsiváis and Pacheco in particular, although many other writers of the time, Carlos Fuentes, Segovia, and others, they were concerned with a particular change of language that came with the process of modernity in this moment that I referred before. If you think about it, Pacheco and Monsiváis, they have as a shared characteristic, even though their answer to this problem is completely different. The question of how do you capture the language of the present whenever you have been trained in a literary system that had, if you remember Modernismo in particular, which was a theme of Pacheco's own research, that sometimes had a very elevated notion of poetry as something that pointed towards the sublime, right? If you think of a poem like Octavio Paz's Piedra de Sol, which is a poem about knowledge and history and tries to capture a lot in the poem, Pacheco is sort of at the antipodes of this. And Monsiváis in a different way too, because what they're doing is saying that there's a language that captures the fleeting experience of a very fast society. And the way Monsiváis did it was through indirect style. So what he did is he created this very Baroque prose that captured oral registers, a plurality of voices, right? So what he did, he worked by accumulation. And that's why he's difficult to read, especially over time, because some of those registers have become historical rather than living. In the case of Pacheco, he worked by distillation. So if you read his text about the idea of poetry, he always talks about the idea that the poem becomes outdated right after you write it. Yeah. Because the poem captures language at a given moment of time, is very connected to its present, but then the present changes, which is why he reviewed his poems. And if you see different versions of his poetry collections, there's changes over time, because that is his way of rendering his poems contemporary. Monsiváis and Pacheco have a concept of the present of the language, whereas many other poets have a concept of language in poetry as something that is more atemporal, or more living like past, sometimes wrote in myth, right, in the space of myth. Even if you look at his translations, since we are talking about binational and transnational context, one of the most important translations by Pacheco is the 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot.
T.S. Eliot.
Republished
he published in Inventarios.
Yeah, and then it was republished as a book in Mexico fairly recently. But T.S. Eliot is that poet. It's a poet that is really rethinking the function of poetry. And in the quartets and in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, he's really also capturing this language of the present in a society that is moving through capitalism, bureaucracy, right? The creation of the spaces like the office. All of those things are very present in Pacheco's writing. And if you look at his criticism, he goes exactly at those moments too. The 19th century is a process of modernization. Modernism is a rapid change that comes with capitalist development, right? The avant-garde is another one of the moments. So he's always in dialogue with the different moments in which language had to be confronted with its present.
Well, you have just underlined several issues that could be a PhD thesis. Sandy, please.
Yes, I would like to add that I could understand the 4 quartets much better when I read the Spanish translation by Pacheco. He elucidated in ways, he made the decisions that I couldn't make in the English, and he made them in Spanish. And it brings out an important part of his whole modus operandi, because he's always in dialogue with other writers. I mean, he could be such a great translator because he is in dialogue with Eliot. And when he writes his own poetry too, Pacheco is in dialogue with others. I think one of the most exemplary points is his poems about Tlatelolco. When he writes them, las lecturas de canciones mexicanas, the readings of the Mexican Aztec songs. And here he is bringing those texts from the past. He's in dialogue with them. He's presenting them to us, and he's bringing it up to the moment of 1968 as well. And as Nacho says, he's always rewriting. And we have maybe 4 different versions of the original, because he's always thinking and rethinking. And he even said, I don't have the exact quote, but he always said that for him, a text is never finished, and he will continue rewriting until the day he dies. And so we see that dynamically in those poems, in the cantares that he created for us, the Tlatelolco. He makes the past alive. He makes those people as if he were talking to Nezahualcóyotl, in 1968. And so this is, I think, a great accomplishment that he has, how he can be in dialogue with people from the past, great writers, and he brings them to the present for us.
So following this, how did he got in this dialogue? And after the great comparison and very thoughtful comparison of Ignacio the way of approaching the writing of Monsiváis and Pacheco. Sandy, you know, José Emilio was a great admirer of Jorge Luis Borges. He even published a book to invite people to read Jorge Luis Borges. I mean, having seen Jorge Luis Borges reading poetry in Mexico in one of these festivals that you may remember, Ignacio, took place at the Sala Olinjo Listli, and it was very moving to see Borges there.
Yeah.
What do you think, Sandy, is the relationship of Pacheco with Borges? And what is the footprint of Pacheco in Latin American poetry, let's say, vis-a-vis someone as Borges that also keeps a dialogue also with past texts and authors?
Yes. Well, I think it's bringing out the fact that Mexican literature is not alone. Borges was important, you know, globally, and I think Pacheco in dialogue with Borges brings out the global nature that, you know, it's not just Mexican literature, but an international Latin American literature, or just literature in general in these conversations he has and in his interest in Borges. And in a sense, too, his interest in Borges goes beyond the sense of poetry, but we have to remember, and I think sometimes the short stories of Pacheco are forgotten in view of the magnificence of his poetry, because he has a number of stories that are fantastic. You know, and here I think he's in dialogue with Borges and Cortázar. And in one of the stories, as I mentioned, the La Fiesta Brava, he even incorporates a parody of one of the stories that could be Pacheco. It could be Cortázar, it could be sort of a Borges kind of thing. And it's in the story. And in it, the writer is trying to sell himself, you know, and he doesn't think he can do it perhaps as a Mexican. So he uses these stories that remind us of Borges and Cortázar. And it's a very interesting story. So what he's doing, in a sense, is keeping up the idea that you go beyond your border, you go beyond the individual. You are trying to show how you can incorporate other voices within your own work. And I think it brings up the community of scholars. And I think that's what's so important in his poetry and in his writing in general. What Pacheco is doing is trying to create this community of like-minded people talking to each other across time and across borders.
And Ignacio, would you like to add something to this dialogue or relationship between Borges and Pacheco and this approach that Sandy has underlined?
And I think that another thing to add is that the connection between Borges in Mexico has two ends, right? Because he has Pacheco on one side, but he has Alfonso Reyes as a very important precursor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you read the line of Reyes, Borges, and then Pacheco and Monsiváis sort of running in parallel, this is a moment of significant realignment of the idea and the social function of literature in Latin America. Mm-hmm. These are very, very erudite thinkers mm-hmm. that in their different ways are rewriting their national traditions. So Reyes is rewriting the Mexican and Latin American tradition. Borges reconfigures Argentine literature. Pacheco rethinks and reconfigures Mexican literature in his criticism. You know, because we focus so much in narrative and in poetry, we forget, for example, that one of his greatest contributions is an anthology of Mexican modernism. That is, I don't know if it was recently republished or is in the process of being republished, but this is a book that really made us rethink a poetry that before Pacheco was sometimes even dismissed as the inferior to the poetry of the avant-garde. Mm-hmm. So for me, the relationship with Borges is also the dialogue of people who have a great amount of knowledge about both their national tradition and the global tradition, mm-hmm. and that really put upon themselves the weight of contributing for these societies to rethink what literature means to them. And Pacheco does it in writing, but he also does it in his teaching. He does it in his public interventions in the Colegio Nacional and in other institutions. And he does it in the Inventario, which is essentially an effort to converse, to have conversations about literature, sometimes with just a translation of a specific author, right? With the general public in Mexico, which is something that has been lost because literary media has been vanishing under the weight of the internet in some levels. And I don't think that we have this kind of wide readership, literary spaces that Pacheco had in Inventario back in the day. I don't think there's something similar to that.
I agree with you. I cannot think of something similar, and I think Inventario is deeply missed. Well, we will go to the second clip that we'll play this afternoon. Is José Emilio Pacheco reading The Acceleration of History from the book And So You Go, Never to Come Back. So this is from the book Te vas, ibas y no volverás. Ready for The Acceleration of History.
Aceleración de la historia. Escribe unas palabras y al minuto ya dicen otra cosa. Significan una intención distinta. Son ya dóciles al carbono 14. Criptogramas de un pueblo remotísimo que busca la escritura en tinieblas.
Well, the theme that you were just talking before, no, this dialogue, this time, this present that passes, but it's also past and present in the future. So how, Sandra, taking advantage of you having met him personally, and the connection, and knowing very well the connection of José Emilio Pacheco with the University of Maryland and his tenure there, what can you tell us, the public today, about his contribution as an intellectual, as a professor to the university and to the American academia, and this sense of constant dialogue with past, present, and with other authors?
Well, I think it's an interesting thing. We can talk about his excellence as a writer, but he was also had excellence as a mentor and a teacher. I don't think there are many professors who could start a seminar at 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon and have people clamoring to get into that class. And I think that's what shows how wonderful a professor he was. He was so humble in a sense, despite all the things, all the accolades of other people. He was always on a very intimate one-to-one relationship with students, and he was a very good mentor too. And many of the students who came to study with him have gone on to successful careers as writers in Mexico. And you know, I think this is a tribute to his work as well. He taught a class in modernism. He taught a class also in writing, actually. So that was all, you know, what he did was continue a tradition of mentoring people go to the future rather than just keep the past. And I think he was a very warm colleague too. We could always go to him and talk. And I think it was not just for faculty, but for students as well. We would be able to have a lunch and chat with him. And he always gave you ideas about new ways of looking at things. And I think this is really what is so remarkable, that he was always in dialogue with what's going on. And you could see that in some of his poetries about even the nature of College Park. He has a poem about Sligo Creek or Berwyn House, where he lived. So, you know, in other words, he created this idea that you didn't have to talk about poetry only in this very high-flown kind of dialogue, but you could, you know, high culture and pop culture made no difference. It could all be part of your poetry, of your writing. And I think that was an excellent example for students and for colleagues and critics. But I had a very personal interaction with him when I was writing an essay on one of his short stories, Tenga para que se entretenga. That is a wonderful title because it is in dialogue, the writer with the reader, literally, you know, or you might say colloquially, here, take this and entertain yourself or have a good time. And in a sense, he was giving the reader a good time with this story, but it's also a phrase that's used within the story where a mysterious man comes out of a cave and entices a young boy to come with him in the cave. And he says to the mother, here, and he gives her a newspaper. tengo para que se entretenga. And so I said to José Emilio, I'm writing this, I love this story, but you know, the critics say that this mysterious man who comes out of the cave is Maximiliano, el emperador, because the story takes place in Chapultepec Park. And José Emilio says, no quiero eso. He didn't want that idea. He says, I don't want them to think it's particularly Maximiliano. I have to rewrite this story. And sure enough, even though there's been published works on the first version, he rewrote and came out with the second version where the dialogue says, was it Maximiliano? Somebody says, and the woman says, oh, no, I know a picture of Maximiliano, it was not him. And so I was able to rewrite my essay in conforming to that story. But it shows you how he's always thinking, how he accepts criticism. And you know, it was just a wonderful memory that I have, and I will always treasure that we were able to interact in that way, and then he changed his story. So again, this idea of his revisions, of his refusal to accept presuppositions necessarily, they're all part of everything he did. And that was what he was like for all of us. Just this little anecdote, but I think many people could tell stories about how he would interact with you and get you to think more and get himself as well to be involved in the next step. So I think that was really the legacy he has for us at Maryland, is how he was always there with us and in dialogue with us.
Oh, it's a great anecdote. Ignacio, you want to add something or mention? I think it's a fantastic anecdote.
I actually met Pacheco once in a conference in Brown University organized by Julio Ortega. Where they were actually giving him a tribute. And one of the reasons why I was able to interact with him is that one of his Maryland students, the writer Jose Ramon Ruiz Sanchez, who was Sandy's student, he's one of my best friends. So he actually invited me to spend some time with him. He was just dazzling, right? Because he's this person that had, correct me Sandy if I'm wrong, because he was just an impression, but he has almost the demeanor of like a Woody Allen character, right? Very self-effacing, you know, self-ironic, at the same time very smart, right? And able to really just drop dazzling information on you. Right. And it was absolutely delightful to spend time with him. But you can also see in that sort of the intersection between having an enormous depth of knowledge and also having no pretension about this knowledge, right? And in the case of his poetry, you can notice it because he has all of these texts where he says, I write this text, but I don't want it to be for posterity. He doesn't care about literary fame or his self-image in that way, neither in his public persona nor in his writing. He has a line that I always remember that he calls those anthologies of complete works of writers, he calls them coffins. Because he says that the writing gets buried in these books and does not keep the writing alive. So I think that the aliveness or the lively character, the being alive of culture in conversation, which is what Sandy's anecdote shows, and in the way in which he writes and rewrites and responds to readers and modernizes the text, he's really one of those rare writers that is focused not on the eternity or the posterity of writing, but rather on the fact that writing only matters if it's alive.
Yes.
Which is more or less the theme of the poem that we heard before. Right. And just to complement his stay in Maryland, Sandy, he stayed in Maryland normally in spring, but we know that spring in Maryland can be like winter in Mexico. So what do you think was the most important legacy of Pacheco for the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Maryland, besides the dialogue that you said that he was always engaged with? How do you think he will be remembered by you, by students as Ruiz Sanchez that Ignacio just mentioned?
Well, I think what Nacho said too, that he was a living example of what one can be. You can be erudite, but you can be down to earth. You can be given many accolades, but you also are modest and humble. He was genuine. He was a genuine human being. And I think that in a sense is the way he modeled what would be the ideal professor, in a sense, that you are open, you have knowledge, and you share your knowledge. You want, to be in dialogue with people. I took him once to an undergraduate class. We had been reading his.
I think we lost you, Sandra. I think we lost the connection with Sandra. So,
true academic, a true literary, and for all. And I think the legacy exists in the sense that we do want to continue his memory with our annual lecture, where we bring someone in to continue the dialogue that he started for us. And again, so many people I can think of: Luis Sanchez, Alvaro Enrique, Tanya Huntington, Coral Bracho. So many people have been through his classes and gone on elsewhere and continue the idea. I think we all incorporate his work in our teaching, in our syllabi. So he is alive. He isn't in a coffin, as Nacho said. And I think that's a great legacy to continue reverberating and echoing in all our minds as what it is to be someone we could look up to and model ourselves after.
Well, in the question and answer session that we are going to arrive, there is one suggestion to dedicate one of the buildings of the University of Maryland to the name of José Emilio Pacheco. I think it's a great idea. And I also think we can, Ishnik, consider for the future to dedicate one of the exhibition rooms or at the Mexican Cultural Institute to José Emilio Pacheco. But let's go to the third poem that he's going to write for us. Our third video is Parque España, from the book Ibas y no volverás, and so you go, never to come back. And it's also a short poem of a park that it's very important because it's in the neighborhood where he lived. So here it goes.
Y del libro llamado Irás y no volverás, que aparece en 1973, son estos textos. Parque España. El surtidor se vuelve una columna del aire, pero la tierra llama y el agua vuelve a su semejanza. Otro poco de la fuente alza el vuelo. Babel erguida en su imposible cohesión, de nuevo torre que a su gran pesadumbre se rinde.
Bueno, Parque España, for all of us, or all of you that are listening to us and that you have been to Mexico City, Parque España was inspired, of course, in Condesa and La Roma neighborhoods, where the novel Las Batallas en el Desierto, Battles in the Desert, takes place. I grew up as a child in Condesa, Roma, very near Plaza de Miravalle, so España is very well known. Those are very important Mexican neighborhoods for many people in Mexico City. And so when I read first Batallas en el Desierto, it impressed me very much because I identified with the neighborhood, with the atmosphere, with what was going on. So although the novel by itself can be the main theme of a whole conversation just dedicated to Batallas en el Desierto, and its influence has long surpassed in his author, because as you said, Batallas en el Desierto, Ignacio, is just this dealing with industrialization of Mexico, with the changing of Mexico, the modernization. Yes. And at the end of the novel, Carlitos, the protagonist, ends reflecting on the fragile nature of history and longing for what it's going, what has gone. And I also want to underline the influence that this novel had in the cultural life of Mexico. It became a song by Café Tacuba that I was just listening again just before joining this conversation. And now it's part of the collective imaginary of most Mexicans. But I would like to ask you, Ignacio, how do you think this novel still can impact the young generations in Mexico or not? Can they identify with Carlitos, with the changing? Do they identify with the masterful way of mastering the language? What is your reflections on that?
I think that the historical experience that is narrated in the novel resonates, even if the way that experience actually exists is different between generations. If you think of, I want to add to your list, besides the Café Tacuba song, there's a movie adaptation by Alberto Isaac called Mariana Mariana. But even in contemporary times, if you think about it, social media, Google, right? And a bunch of other technological advancements that have redefined our life, including now Zoom. These are things that did not exist maybe 20, 25 years ago. There's people whose arch of life is defined by the introduction of these technologies and the very quick changes that happen in that regard, just like Carlitos narrates the introduction of things like the sandwich maker. So I think that the idea of growing up in this kind of moment where life changes by the year, where technological innovation produces different ways of social life, is something that the novel can still teach us, even if the historical moment is different. And the other thing that is very important to notice is that a significant element of the conclusion is that Carlitos has a different destiny than his lower class friend.
Yes.
And I think that the question about the ways in which this process of modernization produce economic and social inequality is a very important reflection of the book that is not always highlighted. But José Emilio Pacheco's writing is very conscious that Carlos's own experience is sheltered by a certain degree of socioeconomic privilege. And I think that in Mexico, we can recognize sort of this divide of living in a country that is at the same time hyper-modern, and in which there is also a lot of poverty and a lot of the difficulties, political, economic, intellectual difficulties that we face as a country are essentially underpinned by that economic inequality. So I think that Pacheco already captures that, and it is a feature that is also very meaningful for a contemporary reader.
Yeah, I'd like to add that it's interesting for not a Mexican reader, but a person who doesn't know much about Mexican literature, picking up this book might look at the title, Battles in the Desert. And especially if you know that his first novel was about wars and the Holocaust, then you wonder that this must be about the Mexican Revolution, perhaps about Pancho Villa in Chihuahua. It's an assumption you might make. And what Pacheco often does is make us rethink our presuppositions. And I think it's an underlying theme in so much of his work. You think you know, but it's not what is going on. And the book is not about the Mexican Revolution at all, but the title refers to something that takes place within the novel, a game that the children play, you know. And so here we are again, like with Alta Traición. He's talking about high treason. No, he's not. He's really showing a true sense of patriotism. And so again, this idea that there are presuppositions of his readers, and he's in dialogue with you, and a little bit of a wink saying, aha, you think you know, but listen to what is really going on. And I think that message resonates whatever period we're in, and especially today, when there's so much false news and makeup. He makes us question our presuppositions, makes us think about it. And again, the novel too, if you reading it now with a feminist perspective, I think it really highlights this Mariana. I mean, I reread it again with my knowledge about La Malinche. I can't help thinking that she is a Malinche figure. You know, the woman who is married or not married is a lover of a foreigner in one country and in another country. And I think that there is this sense that you can read so many things into it about the history of Mexico. And so there is a sense of the subtext of Malinche there too, if you look at it with a feminist eye.
And also, Mariana reflects a change in the way in which women lived in Mexico, right?
Yeah.
In this very conservative society, a woman that has to deal with new structures of employment, of sexual and partner relations, and the way she's judged by the moral world of the time that is narrated in the book really says a lot about the struggle that women had to go through in these
Yes.
processes of modernity. And you are very right that a feminist lens is necessary, because this is another thing that is all over the novel, but is not being
Yes.
underscored in the readings.
Yes.
Of the novel. We're always looking at Carlito's perspective of Mariana, but we
Exactly.
sometimes don't think about Mariana's own
Yes.
angle.
Right. He gives every reader something to look at.
A real work of art has many different readings and interpretations, and that is what makes it a worthy piece.
Yes.
No, and that it really it's sustaining time. I was reading my notes and saying, you know, on the first José Emilio Pacheco Distinguished Lecture and Seminar Series that we organized with the University of Maryland, the Mexican Cultural Institute, Juan Villoro, a great also Mexican writer, emphasized Pacheco's work as a manifestation of the importance of culture and humanities in today's world, which was something that you were saying, Sandra. And that is something that is being discussed when everybody's thinking about programming, about how to deal with technology and with the challenges of artificial intelligence and what is coming. What is the relevance of culture and humanities in today's world? How this is important? Do you agree with Juan Villoro on his appreciation of Pacheco's work?
Oh, definitely. I think more than ever, we need culture, we need the sense of humanities, instead of thinking about artificial intelligence, perhaps, and all the wonderful things Zoom can bring us. We have to remember that we are critical thinkers. We cannot go by rote, we cannot accept. And I think this is often so strong in so many of the works by Pacheco, that we have to be critical thinkers, thinking for ourselves, not accepting the institutional idea of what is, you know, patriotism, and not institutional idea of what was the Mexican Revolution or what happened in Tlatelolco. The idea is that the culture that you create as not just a partial thing, not just for one country, but to see our humanity will enable us to be more compassionate to one another. Reading is supposed to encourage compassion. And I think even within Batallas en el Desierto, the little game that the children play, it used to be people played Cristianos y Moros. Here it's Arabs and Jews that takes place in the novel. It was right after the Holocaust, right after Israel became a nation. And he's showing us that these sources from beyond your country can invade your country, and you may begin to take sides, but perhaps we should look at our common humanity. And I think that's always been what is so impressive about his work, that it does encourage us to understand each other, the humanity we share, and have compassion for each other. And also to understand that we shouldn't be looking at false boundaries and false chronological time. We can learn from the Cantares Mexicanos. We can learn from what's going on elsewhere. And I think these are all very positive ideas that the dear one, you know, Villoro has stressed as well.
And do you agree with Villoro? Ignacio, do you listen?
Oh,
Yeah,
Ignacio.
sorry, you broke up a little bit. I didn't hear the last. Yeah.
Oh.
So I mean, to what Sandy would say, I think that the model of humanist that Pacheco is very much a model of humanist from the 20th century, where people like him, and as I mentioned before, Alfonso Reyes, you know, even, you know, people who also work in diplomacy like Rosario Castellanos, they really had upon themselves to build significant parts of the cultural apparatus and the cultural ideas of the country. And I think that we're facing, you know, this is a very complicated political subject, and I want to just sort of describe it, but we're facing a challenge in the ways in which those institutions were created. We know that university humanities are being defunded in the global scale. We know in Mexico and elsewhere the ways in which the government invests in culture are facing many challenges. Some of them have to do with the demands of public funding. Some of them have to do with the ways in which you distribute them. What kinds of, where do you invest, right? And we know that there are very active debates in which Villoro himself is a participant about this in our own context. And I think that a figure like Pacheco is a very important reminder that having an everyday culture, that the availability of reading as a matter of everyday life, as a matter of education, as a matter of the right to culture and patrimony that a citizen of a country has, is the fundamental goal, regardless of the institutions that you construct to deliver them. We can spend a long time debating about whether the institutions we have or not are ideal, but we definitely understand that the model that our precursors in the 20th century gave us is the belief that there's a right to culture, and that we must always foster a culture that is erudite and at the same time contemporary. And Pacheco is probably the person that best embodied these two dimensions in balance with each other. Sorry.
Right.
I think this combination of these two concepts, erudite and contemporary, in the right to culture, in the right to reading, it's one of the big challenges, and you underline it very well. Before going to the questions and answers of all our participants, because we're having participants in Zoom and in Facebook, and there are several questions that Ishnik is having, I would like to close with a reflection on his, let's say, journalistic writings in Inventario and essays. As I said, for me, and I think I'm just a very humble example of many Mexicans that learn and interpreted reality reading José Emilio Pacheco, Inventarios. First in Diorama de Excelsior, and then in Proceso, when Scherer left Excelsior and then founded Proceso. And he wrote the Inventarios for almost 40 years, from 1973 to 2014, just when he passed away. And as I said at the beginning, for many people, the first thing that we did when we bought Proceso on Sunday or receive it was to open on Inventario and look for the initials JEP, J-E-P. And sometimes he would recommend a book or going back to a rereading of a classical author or authors. Sometimes he was analysis political life in Mexico, but not with estridencias, he was always like a very calm analysis and a very interesting point of view. And there are a lot of people that do now cultural journalism that think that cultural journalism will not be in Mexico what it is without José Emilio Pacheco and his Inventarios. Just in 2017, an anthology of Inventarios was published, not all of them, but three volumes. And the compilation, the anthology, was done by Eduardo Antonio Parra. And so, Ignacio, how do you fit these Inventarios and his work as a journalist, a cultural journalist, with the poetry, with the novels? Because sometimes people think that only poetry and novels are important. And sometimes what people may remember more are his works on cultural journalism. What is your take on this?
Cultural journalism is the essential outlet to make literature public. It's a democratic structure for literature. The book is an object that is wonderful, but in our country in particular, it sometimes is a little too expensive, right? Even though there's efforts in the government right now to make it more accessible. But it's pricey, it's expensive to produce, right? It doesn't circulate equally. And journalism in the time of the magazine that Pacheco wrote, and now in the time of the internet, is one of the ways in which you can expand and democratize writing. What I think happened, that what Inventario means is that it is not in the model of the cultural supplement that we saw for many years in Mexico, which is sort of a self-referential section of the newspaper where wonderful writing happens, but most of its readers are intellectuals. Inventario is in the context of a magazine that really sought to have a general reader that did not belong to the intellectual and the cultural world. And that is a mode of address that I think we could use more in Mexico today, because we have great writers, some of whom write only for the people who already have access to the cultural world. And we have other great writers that have opinion columns that reflect on questions of politics and what we call actualidad, right? Like the everyday workings. But I think we need more people who, like José Emilio Pacheco, devote their name and their energy to just share acts of reading, acts of translation with the general public of writers. It is, I believe that literature is a right. And I don't believe that you achieve that right necessarily only by writing literature. You need to have bridges of engagement with an audience that changes all the time. And Pacheco's own sense of the present allowed that the inventarios from the 1970s and the inventarios from 2010 were different texts from each other, because he was very aware of the evolution of his own audience in his writing. And the younger people who read in the time of social media, video games, right? And sort of this multi-dimensional electronic culture, then there are readers. They read a lot. They read a lot in their phones. They read a lot in the internet, but they do not have the same practices of reading as 20 years ago. And José Emilio Pacheco's Inverterio was exemplary in understanding that readers evolve over time, and that if you write towards that evolving audience, you are creating a more democratic and a more inclusive literature.
It's a very, very interesting reflections. Really make you think. Sandra, would you like to add anything?
No, I agree, you know, and I think in a sense, the title Inventario also, it's not that he's putting it into this high level, you know, but he's saying, these are things I'm thinking about, inventions almost, we might say, with echoing from that word. It's almost like being in conversation with him. That would be what it was like often at the university, to hear him, you know, say, oh, I read this and this is what I think about it. And so then he would write it down. It was almost like you would read, but he would say these things to you. And I think that's what Nacho is pointing to do, the accessibility. And I think it again goes right back to his importance he places on dialogue with everyone. He would talk to everyone. You know, he didn't just talk to the elite. He didn't just talk to full professors when he was at the university. He talked to the secretaries. He talked to the cleaning women who were Latinas. He was accessible. And I think that's what his journalism does, is make things accessible. And that's a treasure.
Yeah, you know, I was reading the anthologies, and Fernando Benitez said that cultural journalism was literature done under pressure. But once when Octavio Paz won the Nobel Literature Prize, my husband was the chargé d'affaires in Madrid. So we went to see him and with complete works and said, please dedicate it to us. And he wrote to my husband, because diplomacy is journalism in a slow motion. So it's interesting to compare these two definitions when you're thinking on José Emilio Pacheco, and also you were thinking on the title Inventario, to invent something. You know, I think as a bureaucrat, Inventario as a list of things that we have to check if they exist or not. And I think on the work of José Emilio Pacheco in Inventario as a list of all the themes that characterize an era, a very important era of Mexico, and that you can trace maybe the Mexican cultural history just reading Inventario and trying to identify the issues or the themes that were there. So I don't want to speak anymore. I'm just immensely grateful. I will go back to Ixnik, which she's dealing with the questions and answers, because I think the public wants to take advantage of all your knowledge, Ignacio and Sandra, about José Emilio's work. It has been really an honor and a privilege for me to share this afternoon with you. I hope that it will not be the last time, and that we will continue to engage in José Emilio Pacheco's work and also in Mexican culture. Ixnik, the floor is all yours to go to the questions and answers.
Thank you.
De todo corazón.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bárcena and Professor Cypess and Professor Sánchez-Prado. And let me first let you know that our guests and our audience is very thankful for your conversation. They seem to have enjoyed it a lot. And they have posed a couple of questions that I'm going to present to you. The first one, and this is for whomever wants to answer it. Can you guys talk about Pacheco's relationship with Juan José Arreola? Would any one of you like to address that? And also Ibero-American, I see here that they're also asking about that parallel or relationship.
I mean, the concrete relations would probably require having researched them after receiving the question, but can be improvised in the forum, right?
I agree.
I mean, they're writers that are connected intellectually and stylistically. Arreola, like Borges, ties to the question of the role of what we call fantastic literature to the contemporary El Principio del Placer, you know, dialogues very directly with Arreola's Confabularios, and Pacheco wrote about Arreola's Confabulario for sure. And Ibero-American is another one of those writers that were also in a different style, but very committed to this capturing of the present of the country. The instructions to live in Mexico by Ibero-American are strictly contemporary to the inventarios in their early writing, at least until the passing of Ibero-American. So they're writers that are concerned with the same period of time and the same questions, just in different dimensions and manifestations. I think that the person that, I'm not a biographical critic, so I'm not the kind of person that makes much of whether a writer had a specific moment of encounter with one or the other, but I really think that there is a network of intellectual challenge going on in between newspapers, literary writing, and the construction of cultural institutions in Mexico in which all of these characters participate.
Yeah, and Ibero-American too, with his sense of humor, I would connect him with Pacheco in that way. And I think when that terrible plane accident, when Ibero-American passed away with Marta Chava and Ángel Rama and all, Pacheco does have a poem about it. So I think, unfortunately, at the end, there was that homenaje to Ibero-American.
Great. We have two questions about Morirás Lejos. One has to do with its publishing history. They're asking why, if you know, it hasn't been, why it's harder to find copies of Morirás Lejos than it is to find Batallas en el Desierto. I don't know if you can speak to that. And the other question has to do with the themes of Morirás Lejos. As we know, it speaks to the horrors of the Holocaust. And the question is if we know if this is an unprecedented topic for a Mexican writer at the time. We know that it's not so unprecedented afterwards, but before then, was it a novel thing to read?
Oh, I think it was at that time. I can't remember how many others would be, but it's a clearly parteaguas, I would say, you know, changing a direction. It's a complex novel. I'm sure Nacho could speak to that. You know, it's so different from Batallas en el Desierto in that regard. It's complex. It's a mystery. It does involve the reader. I think if you give it the time, if you let go of all your presuppositions and enter into it, he creates a mystery for you, and it's not really solvable easily by the author. The narrator, in a sense, relinquishes his ability to tell everything. And so the reader has to make a lot of decisions. There was a translation, and it's very hard to get. I agree. It's not an easy novel to get a hold of, and certainly not in English translation. Battles in the Desert and Other Stories is available. But for some reason, maybe because of its complexity, it has had that problem.
Yeah, Morirás Lejos, formally speaking, is an anomaly in Pacheco's work because it is unusually obscure and complex in relationship to everything else that he wrote. I think it belongs more to a generation of books in Mexico that saw this kind of more esoteric and difficult writing as a way to counter the idea of having to write nationalist literature, right? So it can tie to Salvador Elizondo's Parabeu, for example, which is also another novel. And there's a lot of, you know, very experimental novels in the 60s that you can connect it to. I see that the person who has the question also asks about the novels, about the horrors of the Holocaust. And in reality, there's a long tradition of Latin American and Mexican novels that tie to this connection. Pacheco's was one of the first ones, but certainly one can remember here the novels of the writers of the Crack group, right? Ignacio Padilla and Jorge Volpi, Pedro Ángel Palou have novels that reflect on the Nazis and the Holocaust. And there's, you know, writings by Jewish Mexican writers that directly and indirectly refer the topic. But I think that it is a very difficult, it's a novel that you won't even see in discussions about Pacheco, because it's almost like it was written by somebody else. And it is a novel that came in the first edition, and I don't think it got republished. It is now available, but I don't think it was reprinted in his lifetime. But I may be wrong. This might be inaccurate, but it was out of print for many years. So it never actually even capitalized from the reputation that Pacheco got from his other writings in terms of readers.
Great, thank you. And I have another one from our guests here, and I think that's a very interesting one. To introduce José Emilio Pacheco to young readers, which book or readings would you recommend? I think I know what you're going to say, but could you add to that the reasons why you would choose that?
Well, Batallas en el Desierto, of course, is a novel that would be easily available. And again, as I said, finding out about how this novel was used with this educator or psychologist with a student who is resistant to read and yet wanted to read after Batallas en el Desierto. But for other young male writers, I guess El Principio del Placer, the principle of pleasure, or the pleasure principle, or the beginning of pleasure, is a short story too that would be, I guess, accessible and interesting for young readers. So some of the poems, of course, are fun, but Nacho, you can answer that.
I actually think that it is a great poet to introduce people to poetry, because he demystifies the idea that poetry is not easy to understand or that it is inaccessible. His poetry is humorous, you know.
Oh, the animal poetry, right.
It's very present. So I think you can teach, you can give one of his collections or anthologies to a younger reader, and it really is one that to the right young reader would change just the very idea of poetry that they would have as something inaccessible. Although I have to say that contemporary poetry, it's interesting because it doesn't happen in Mexico as much, but if you look in English, conversational poetry is very mainstream. And José Emilio Pacheco really foresees the notion that that conversational poetry was going to be more predominant in many poetry traditions around the world, more so than it was when he was writing it. Of course, Nicanor Parra was writing the antipoemas, but these were anomalies. These were not the main line of Latin American poetry at the time.
Right.
That's right. So I have, before I give the microphone back to Ambassador Bárcena, I have nothing else to say but to thank you for joining us and for enlightening us about the signer of a good part of our sentimental education as far as Mexican people go. I think most people of my generation and generations after mine and of José Emilio Pacheco's generation got to enjoy his work and to see their country and certainly Mexico City perfectly reflected in his words. And I'm very grateful. I'm very happy that we got to do this. And I'm hoping that we get to do something like this again. So I'll be bothering you soon. Ambassador Bárcena, please.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Ignacio, both PhDs, both professors. It has been great to share with you this afternoon. I was just remembering that when I was ambassador to Denmark, we were planning to invite José Emilio Pacheco in 2000, I think it was like 2008, because he had been also working with Norway for different reasons. And we wanted to take him to Norway. Then he got sick, he couldn't do it. And this is something that I will always miss, not to have had the opportunity of having him both in Denmark and in Norway, which there was great admiration for his work and for his poetry by different poets, including Malinowski, that used to work a lot with Alberto Blanco and other poets that were admirers of José Emilio Pacheco. I also want to underline the great relationship of José Emilio Pacheco with the University of Maryland that has opened so many opportunities for collaboration between the University of Maryland and the Mexican Cultural Institute, the embassy, with the Library of Congress. The librarian is great. We are planning to work for the future also on native poetry with the current poet laureate Joy Harjo. And so I just want to say again, gracias, to deeply thank the Ibero-American Cultural Attachés Association, who had this idea of going through different authors from Latin America and Spain and Portugal with the live voices of La Palabra of the Library of Congress. I like to thank the Library of Congress again, the Mexican Cultural Institute, the Spanish and Portuguese program of the University of Maryland, the Washington University in St. Louis, for all their support to make this webinar happen. And I want to send a very, very special thanks to the Pacheco family, to Cristina, to Laura Emilia. I forgot the name of his other daughter. I apologize, please. Is Nick. I know that they have continued the work of José Emilio, the love for the culture, for the books, for literature, for libraries. And as you said, Ignacio, literature is a right, culture is a right, reading should be a right and an enjoyment. And José Emilio Pacheco is one of our great figures to continue to promote Mexican culture and to engage all Mexico and all the generations in reading and in seeing a future in analyzing our contemporary life. So again, thank you very much. We will continue to work on so many issues and so many common programs in the future. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you so much. A pleasure. It was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Until next time.
Bye.
Placer. Bye.